Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. As usual, you're with Mike.
And Ian.
And we are, of course, rereading the Aubrey Maturin books of our favorite author, Patrick O'Brien. Ian, we're almost halfway through Blue at the Mizzen. Can you catch us up to where we are and what we have to look forward to this week?
I can, and with great pleasure. So, Mike, last time, Jacob's decoded note had told Sir Joseph and Stephen that a different Chilean independence group had asked another commander by the name of Sir Joseph Lindsay to take charge of their naval forces. Our own commander, of course, Jack Aubrey, had been to Shelmerston to pick up some men. He had had the Surprise repaired at long last after many chapters of back and forth and damage and redamage, and had agreed to take on Prince William's nephew, in air quotes, probably illegitimate son, by the name of Horatio Hanson as a midshipman. We spent some time then at Woolcombe with the Aubrey family and their associates. This time, Mike, there are irregularities of the digestive kind in particular aboard the Surprise. Mr. Midshipman Hanson makes progress with Jack as his mentor. Stephen hopes for intelligence from Dr. Jacob. Meanwhile, the galley chorus rallies around Stephen Maturin. So, Mike, lots of our favorite characters wending their way through the story in this chapter. Let's get into it.
Oh, let's do. It's 6 a.m. Jack is up on deck. He's come aboard, his hair streaming in the wind, with jacket on. And it's the end of a blow, having just watched a wave kind of sweep across the entire Surprise. He tells Harding that perhaps they could omit the washing of the decks, since nature seems to have taken care of that this morning. And he greets Mr. Hanson, who's at the end of his watch. They had cleared the channel after 3 days of really hard beating up, and finally now have hundreds of miles to leeward of anything dangerous. They're sailing on. Jack goes back, naps for a bit, wakes at 7:30 a.m. to a surly Killick, who is upset because he doesn't have any bad news to share, and then remembers, the doctor fell out of his cot during the night and Wantage lashed him in tightly, so he's certainly going to be late for breakfast here. Well, Jack's thinking all these officers of the watch, usually he'd invite some to breakfast, but they're whipped from having fought that storm, and Stephen's probably going to be pretty snappish, so maybe we'll just eat alone today.
Doesn't seem all that unusual. Snappish Stephen, grouchy Killick, and it's breakfast time. But we're going to learn bit by bit what's been going on aboard ship here. And Mike, we got a little hint about this at the end of the previous chapter, something about rhubarb. And we learn what's been going on here. Stephen, having recovered from being lashed into his hammock, is tons happier after breakfast and plenty of pots of coffee. And Jack gets into a conversation with him about the recovery of Horatio Hanson. And I'm going, recovery from what? Stephen says, well, Hanson, being such a young guy, had made his recovery all the quicker, helped along by, and now we get a clue as to what he's been treating, helped along by Stephen's Veracruz jalap. Okay. Most of the others in the sickbay, he says, are on some kind of rhubarb. Again, have to figure out what's going on here. And meanwhile, he even goes on to tell us, as if we all know what he's talking about, the varieties of rhubarb that he's been playing with, including Aleppo, Smyrna turkey roots, the best Russian, and some Banbury rhubarb. Despite all of these different varieties, now we start to find out what's happening with the patients. They are, he says, in a sad state of flux. And state of flux doesn't just mean that they're undergoing change. State of flux means that they have loose bowels.
Right.
It's very funny. We've talked about this. There's a great strand of potty humor going on here, but O'Brien's hidden it, right? Just half a layer below the surface. Do you want to tell us, first of all, about Veracruz jalap?
Well, Veracruz jalap, I went to my trusty Matron's Medicine and was a little shocked to see that the site that has hosted Matron's Medicine for almost decades now is no longer. I thought, what am I going to do? Luckily, wiki.hmssurprise.org, part of the original kind of gunroom group that still has a version of Matron's Medicine on their hmssurprise.org wiki. So went back to that, and according to Matron's Medicine, that This jalap is the dried root of a Mexican vine of the morning glory family. For some of you 60s kids, morning glories always think hallucinogens. No, no, no. This is used as a purgative. A purgative, of course, being a drug for purging the bowels. So, wait. Everybody's got loose bowels, and we're purging them. And rhubarb is, in fact, also a different kind of purgative. Same thing.
Yep.
And when Stephen had mentioned all those different kinds of rhubarbs, the fact of the matter is those are all absolutely medicinal rhubarbs, not just your plain kitchen rhubarb kind. And people still debate which makes the better purgative. And I love this list because, Russians kind of, a lot of people say one of the best. He even includes in that, in addition to the Turkish, banberry, which was the original English purgative form of rhubarb. It was a derivative from one of the finest Russians at the time. So O'Brien is setting up this rhubarb story and all this dysentery potty humor, as you'd said, forecasted a little bit in the closing words of the last chapter, and he runs it. He just keeps on milking it a little bit through this chapter here.
He does. We get a little insight then into Stephen's practice as a clinician. These are patients with dysentery, right? And Jack expresses a bit of disquiet about Stephen's methods. Surely, he says, you don't experiment on your patients. And Stephen says, well, of course he does. Like, by the way, every clinician experiments in a low-key way on their patients because nothing is certain in medicine. He says it's the same as the way that you experiment with sails and arrangements of sails to see what suits a particular boat. He's doing the same with patients. Different constitutions, as he points out, require different remedies. This is especially true when they're being fed salt pork that's crossed the Atlantic 4 times already, including, as he says, for a long pause in Kingston, Jamaica, where I'm sure it got especially ripe and fruity. Stephen, he says, is working on the basis of similia similibus, which we need to come back to. And he notes that he's been following along the results of all these different remedies. He's looking, though, at the fact that he's running quickly out of medical supplies. Before they'd cleared soundings, he said, 3/4 of the surprises had been helpless, incapable of duty, but eager and willing to take enormous doses of rhubarb. So, besides getting yet another reference to Stephen's ongoing joke that seamen will dose themselves with huge quantities of whatever you ask them for, this is an interesting little cutaway into homeopathy, okay? Similia similibus, the full Latin tag is similia similibus curentur, and that's the same term that was used by Samuel Hahnemann, the sort of inventor, the pioneer, if you like, of the practice of homeopathy, to describe his discipline. It literally means like cures like. So if you've got a disease of X, you take a bit of X to cure you. This could explain then why Stephen's treating dysentery with a laxative. Now, from a sort of 20th, 21st century medicine perspective, there's a tiny grain of sense in this, which is that if you've got a pathogen, in this case a dysentery organism, in your bowel, then taking something to purge you arguably gets rid of the organism even faster. But since the dysentery is causing you the looseness in the first place, I'm surprised he hasn't killed anybody, because these days we know about hydration and we know about electrolytes, but I just can't imagine what it's like for these seamen who are being given all these routes and treatments by Stephen going, take this, it'll make you go even more. Anyhow, it's a nice Easter egg as well to take us back to the world of Hahnemann. Hahnemann, the discoverer or founder, if you like, of the discipline of homeopathy, was mentioned way back in chapter 3 of The Wine Dark Sea, being fictitiously ascribed to having a species of petrel named after him, Hahnemann's petrel. And we've also seen Stephen use some of this same approach to treatment when he's experimented with other plants that might be toxic but might also be curative. We've talked about foxglove, we've talked about aconite, we've talked about leopard's bane, and so on many times. So I think we're allowed to believe that it's all going to be okay, and that the Shalmastonians aboard the Surprise are robust enough to deal with a few days of of being laid low with not only the disease but also Stephen's cure. And certainly people as young and vital as young Hanson are up and about again reasonably soon here.
Right. And we kind of come back to exactly that point. After attending to his duties on deck, Jack asks Horatio how he's feeling, and he says, I'm feeling fine, sir. He says, well, now, have you been attending to my advice for first voyagers to be meek and mute in the berth? Hanson says, well, I have, sir, but one member of the berth, and he doesn't call him out, so he's not an informer, says he called me a pragmatical son of a bitch, and I thought I had to resent it. And Jack says, well, it wasn't an officer, just a member of berth. Correct. Well, then of course you had to resent it. And then he looks at Hanson's hands and comments on, wow, that was a pretty heavy left-handed blow to split the skin that way. And Jack says, well, I've got a feeling nobody else in the berth is likely to speak to you like that again. This guy's got a left like that. Yeah, he's going to be all right. But Jack has to step back into his role as captain too. He says, and O'Brien writes, but if it should happen, you must say, blackguard me as much as ever you choose. The captain has tied my hands. And Hanson replies, yes, sir, with proper deference and a total want of convictions. It's like, yeah, no. All right, I'm going to do it because you say so here. Right.
If he was a 21st century teenager, he'd have said, yeah, whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, boomer.
Right.
Oh, now, two things that I like about this. One is that we're changing up our classical model of midshipman. The classical model of a midshipman that's a protege of either Jack or Stephen is that they're a bit of a weakling and a bit other and a bit sort of isolated. This time, we're learning that this kid who could have been a bit of a weakling has been able to dish it out rather than just take it. And I think we've talked about this before, Mike. There's this idea of O'Brien sort of approvingly referring to men who can give and receive a blow.
Right, true.
And I'm not going to say he's encouraging violence, but I think he appreciates people who are able to muster some physical aggression in their character. And it's here again with Hanson. And I think it's meant to make us think, yay, good for Hanson.
Right.
Now, Jack says that this might be a good moment to continue some of Hanson's education here. And he says, it's not what you would call lively anymore. And what Jack means by not lively is that the mastheads are sweeping an arc of no more than 40 degrees, which sounds stomach-churning enough. So he invites young Hanson to climb with him up to the mizzen cross trees, reminds him about the old rules, use both hands, never look down. Hanson says, oh, yes, sir. And Jack says, okay, away aloft, and up they go. And by the way, Mike, and you and I were talking about this. You say, could you simulate this anywhere? If anybody wants to try this, they run a pretty good rigging climb experience at the Cutty Sark down in Greenwich. So if you're ever in Southeast London and you want to give this a try with all the necessary safety equipment, you can climb the rigging on the Cutty Sark. Anyhow, Hanson doesn't need that because he's got the real thing. But Mike, I think you particularly latched onto this idea of a way aloft. It sounds like a good phrase to use, right?
It does. And it's funny. Maybe it's the way Patrick Tall was saying it in this situation. I thought, oh man, I'm going to start, we all talk about, people who read O'Brien, these little phrases of his that we use. And I said, away aloft. That's going to be one of my new ones. I don't know if that's on a coffee cup, but I think, when we're starting something, when we're getting after it, away aloft. I just love this. And I thought, well, I'm remembering this so fondly from this chapter. And I thought, well, has he used this before? Yeah, he's used it a lot before. It's been in, this is the 8th book it's been in, but I thought, I've never really caught it before. I thought, well, maybe because it was used routinely, like way aloft and everybody goes and changes the sails. And in fact, it had, but there was one that had completely escaped my mind. If we remember back in Treason's Harbor, Ponto, the dog, had fallen into the cistern with Jack. Yes. Jack's trying to get him out, falls in with him, and he is heaving Ponto up. And as he heaves him up, he says, away aloft. And I thought, well, now that should have been, but I think this, both Ponto and the resonance of this young Hanson and his eagerness to learn, I thought, yeah, away aloft. Let's go. I love this phrase.
Excellent. So here we go. Away aloft. Jack and Hanson are climbing the rigging. They get close to the lower side of the top. And Mike, we all know what feature, we all know what landmark they're approaching, right? Jack goes round the futtock shrouds, round the outside like a seaman. He tells Hanson, you can go through the lubber's hole. Welcome aboard to the lubber's hole, Horatio Hanson. And as Hanson kind of worms his way up to the lubber's hole, Jack climbs around the outside, drops down off the rail into the top with Hanson there. And he gives us, Mike, instructions for Horatio Hanson aloft, instructions for all of us for life here. You must always come up through the lubber's hole for the first 7 times. To be sure, it looks lubberly, but 7 times is the law. You will soon get used to it laying aloft, and after those holy 7 times, you will use the futtock shrouds without thinking about it. And Mike, there you go. That's the official FDA recommended minimum dose for a lubber's hole, which is 7 circumnavigations, right? Remember where you heard it first.
Dude, Drew, well done. Those holy 7 times. Got to listen to the lubber's hole as you're reading through O'Brien. It's funny, when I was reading this, I was thinking about O'Brien always does such a great job making us think about present circumstances while writing so accurately about the past. But I never realized how prescient he is. And I shouldn't be surprised. Remember a few chapters ago, he was talking about Nostradamus and Old Moore. So, these guys who predict the future. And I think, as you pointed out, Ian, we just heard O'Brien's prediction 2 decades before the Lover's Hole podcast. He's giving advice to all his readers 7 times. You really need to listen 7 times with your first 7 circumnavigations. So it's humbling. It's it's gratifying. Thank you, Patrick O'Brien. Thank you, listeners.
Words from the master, Mike. Who are we to gainsay the idea that people should navigate the Lubber's Hole 7 times? Yeah, absolutely. I tell you what, if you've ever listened to the Lubber's Hole 7 times around, you'll be able to finish our sentences off even more than we can finish our own sentences off for each other.
Too true.
And you'll have run out of Lubber's Hole bingo cards by then as well. Heaven forbid. Now, O'Brien fills in a little bit of the context here about what kind of a voyage this is. He says that Jack's voyages, such as this, very long distance kind of blue ocean voyages, weren't really the kind of experience to suit a first voyager. But when Jack has one of these youngsters aboard, it's his habit to get them to literally know the ropes. He takes them up aloft in the rigging himself as part of his kind of first contact with them, because he wants to learn quickly about the boy, as well as helping the boy to learn about his environment. Jack, the captain, wants to learn about the boy. And he says also to make ordinary human conversation possible, a very rare thing between the extremes of rank. So when he's up there aloft with Horatio, he can talk at least older man to younger man rather than captain to subordinate. And he carries on teaching Horatio about the running rigging. He points out as we go along that Horatio's hand is bleeding on his trousers. And this is a callback to the little injury that he's picked up for himself defending his honor in the midshipman's berth there. Jack recommends cold water to get the blood out of his breeches and asks, pretty naturally as a follower, did you ever have boxing lessons? And he's pleased to learn that Hanson had some boxing experience with his schoolmates. He'd been instructed by a coachman's boy whose uncle had been a real prize fighter. And this sets Jack alive with reminiscence. By the way, Mike, I think that Jack is enjoying this reminiscence partly because it's taking him back to thinking about Barrett Bonden. But that never gets mentioned explicitly.
Oh, my gosh. Great point, Ian.
Yeah. And Jack says when he had been a reefer, they had set matches with others in the berths and had challenged other ships in the squadron. And Hanson says that sounds like it would be capital fun. How much do you weigh? Asks Jack, ever the boxing promoter. 7 stone, says Hanson, which, for those of you who don't think in stones but think in pounds, that's 98 pounds. He's a pretty weedy 15-year-old to be defending himself with his fists. But anyhow, says Jack, we'll see what we can do.
I'm listening to this. We have stories here in the U.S. about the 98-pound weakling, the kid that gets the sand kicked in his face at the beach. And I was kind of wondering if this kind of weedy teen, if this is Jack's way of trying to earn him, this is his first voyage, maybe to earn him a little bit more respect in the berth and around the ship. And part of that, I think, is me remembering back. I was a pretty weedy teen when I moved from the inner city, this high school of 3,000, to a rural eastern North Carolina community of, we probably numbered more in the hundreds. So my school, certainly not much over. And so there was a very low bar for participating in the American football. I had never played, but everybody's like, okay, you got to be on the team here. And I'm skinny. I don't know what I'm doing. Nobody knows me. I'm not from around here. I talk funny. But the coach had decided this is the off season, that wrestling is a great way to keep everybody fit. Well, I came from Pennsylvania and Baltimore, where wrestling was like the thing. And so I had wrestled. I wasn't particularly good, but I was knowledgeable of it, had grown up with it. And none of these huge football players had ever wrestled. They didn't know anything about it other than childhood horseplay. And so it turned out that I pinned everybody on the team. And it was a
Yay.
great way to kind of get this skinny, funny talking, strange looking kid acclimated. So I'm hoping for Hanson, maybe this could come to fruition as well.
Fantastic. The coach kept you in the team when the season came around?
Oh, a starting offense and defense, which to our misery probably wasn't the great idea, but it was good stuff.
Very good. Back with Jack and Horatio. They have got up to the Mizzen top, but they're not done yet. Jack invites young Hanson to climb up to the cross trees, and the call once again is away aloft. And here's O'Brien's description of them right up at the pinnacle. There they sat, one each side of the mast, each with an arm around it. They seemed incomparably higher up here, the sea stretching almost to infinity, the sky unimaginably vast. Horatio had opened his mouth to exclaim at the ethereal beauty of the ship and her setting, when he remembered the words mute and meek, and shut it again. Well done. He's a fast learner, this kid, isn't he?
Right.
He's not going to be a Jagiello. Anyway, they descend once more, back down on deck. Jack tells Horatio to go up with one of his mates, like Mr. Daniel, next time. And in a week, he says, you will find it as easy as kiss my hand. Horatio, thanks, Jack, says he's never seen anything so beautiful in all his life and wishes it could go on forever. And here I think he's overstepped the mark that he was making for himself. And he realizes that perhaps he's been a bit too enthusiastic. And just when he's thinking, how can I get myself out of this? The lookout cries, there she blows. Oh, there she blows. 3 points on the starboard bow. Pardon me, sir, he added in a lower tone, for this was not a Royal Navy cry. So, Mike, sounds like we've got somebody on lookout here who's a whaling man from his background.
Exactly. And he's a whaling man. His enthusiasm transfers to the crew, and everybody is up there watching, cheering for this whale and her 6 companion whales moving along here. Jack calls up to Reynolds saying, what kind of whale is that? And Reynolds says, right whale, sir. Right as right could be. Later at the midshipman's berth dinner, a master's mate asks, why are they called right whales? And Adams, Jack's clerk, says, well, that's because they're right in every respect. They're found in the right place. They have the right whalebone, the best in the market, the right amount of oil, 6 or 7 tons, and the right temperament. And the text goes on to say, not dashing about like your fin whale or turning spiteful and crushing your boat like a sperm. You cannot say fairer. And so we're getting this, we're starting to see, here's different kinds of whales and the effects of that. And we'll continue to follow through on things like that here. But in the meantime, the pudding comes in and Daniel offers a toast to a sweet and prosperous voyage.
Oh. Well, the voyage is sweet, right? Even though the breeze is faint, we've got a calm sea, we've got plenty of live gunnery practice, Jack's favorite occupation, shooting at targets, timing the broadsides. There are a few new men, and they're able to pick up on Jack's belief that if a ship can manage 3 broadsides in 5 minutes, then there is no enemy that can stand against her. Jack is pleased with his performance. He thinks, though, that they'll be even better by the time they reach Freetown. Now, one more chance for me to say the phrase, stick a pin in it. Stick a pin in the fact that we're headed to Freetown. We'll come back to this. Jack and Stephen, meanwhile, walk into the great cabin. They learn that the Ringle is now in sight. So Jack receives the young gentleman's workings, their latitude and longitude estimations, delivered by Mr. Adams, since the sailing master Woodbine is back on the seat of ease. Clearly somebody whose dysentery treatment is not yet completely run its course. Stephen reflects that the master is one of his most obstinate cases. And he talks about how difficult it can be to treat sailors because he says they are either intolerably garrulous about their symptoms or obscure, taciturn, even secretive, as though they suspected the medical man of trying to entrap them, perhaps even lead them to surgery. Surgery, heaven forbid, right?
Right.
I'm guessing then that Stephen's characterizing the master as the latter type, the obscure, taciturn, secretive type, which probably goes with him being an older guy anyway. And Mike, we're getting comparisons between different groups going on here. We've got different kinds of whales. We've got different kinds of patients, and setting up differences, perceived differences between groups. That seems to be a bit of a theme here, don't you think?
Yeah, there really is. And it's matched along with this other idea, kind of like Jack and different kinds of sails for different boats, and Stephen, different kinds of medicines and treatments for different patients. I'm wondering, is this just sort of O'Brien's way of making these great insights into human behavior and human nature and day-to-day life? Or are we setting up for something? It's funny, I'm affected by age. I really can't remember what happens in the rest of the book or the next chapter. I really need to read ahead, but I kept wondering here, what's going on? What's going on with all these? Fascinating. But we
Well,
do return to something familiar, though. Here are all these different groups and everything else, and now, like, a little something grounding.
yeah, definitely. We have a little bit of a reference to music. Stephen notices there in the cabin the score of a prelude and fugue in D minor for violin and cello that he, Stephen, had composed a little while ago and had copied thanks to the calm seas. Jack notices Stephen's glance down at the music and says he's been making attempts on the opening page of the prelude, but says his playing has gotten worse, and since they haven't been playing much at all. And Stephen supports that observation. It's been a while since we played together. And it's a lovely but bittersweet moment because we get a little glancing reference to music, but no sign yet that they're about to sit down and have a real set to with the music. Prelude and fugue in D minor, I can't make anything of, Mike. I don't think you'd really have a prelude and fugue for just two voices, for two single voice instruments, a violin and a cello. Maybe, but it would be a strange old thing. So anyhow, it's a piece. D minor, even so, is a sad sounding key. So maybe this is a little bit of a callback to Stephen, who'd been writing sarabands as a way of working through his grief, working through his situation having lost Diana. Whether he's still in the grieving process or not, we might find out shortly. But for now, a little hint, but no more, of the musical life that normally goes on between Jack and Stephen. Anyhow, Jack had been looking at these workings provided by the young gentleman, holds up two sets of workings and tells Stephen that they'll give him pleasure. Like Stephen knows what he's looking at. Both of these two young gentlemen agreed on the ship's position to only a matter of seconds of arc, which is a really, really tiny matter of scant miles. One is John Daniel, and it would be expected from him that he'd have a good set of observations, and the other is from young Hanson. And Jack says, this is great work. He praises Hanson's former tutor. He praises the sextant that they must have been using, the finest sextant that Jack has seen, the sextant that the Duke himself had given to Hanson. And tapping the wood of his chair, expressing a wish for good luck, therefore, Jack says, if both of these agree, and if the wind holds, we're going to reach Madeira in a week. So, Mike, it sounds like we've got sweet sailing. It sounds like we've got a very amenable and welcome young character here in Hanson. And we've got the mention of Madeira, so maybe this is a good time for a break. We'll be right back in just a moment. If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/LoversHole. So here we are back again, Mike. We've all been close to Madeira, but the ship's still not quite there, right?
It's not. We're just a few days out, and Jack's thinking, "Oh my gosh, I got all these things to do. Let me get my ongoing letter to Sophie finished up so I can get it out with the first packet that we see." And he's writing and he's telling her how good it is to be sailing with a kindly wind and a crew of almost all right seamen, most of whom he's known for years. And then he starts the next page and he's starting to tell her that some of them, this crew that's been together for so long, they're really missing that wartime perpetual vigilance of scanning the horizon for an enemy or, even better, a lawful prize. And that sailing on calm water in peacetime can seem rather flat to a thankless mind, he adds. And then he decides, I don't need to be going this direction with Sophie. This is not what she needs to hear. I wish it was more dangerous. Wish I was at greater risk here. So he balls up that piece of paper, and then he begins that next paragraph again, telling Sophie how even some of the old shipmates can be a little difficult on occasion. He says, Awkward Davis, one of your favorites, can be positively dogged if crossed by a new hand. But his berserker ways are worth his considerable weight in gold when we're in a fight, and he's great to have around when you're trying to sway up a mass shorthanded. But he said just the other day that shy, nice boy Horatio Hanson that Sophie had met had gotten caught in the rigging at a very great height. That Davies had pushed Joe Place aside, Hanson's sea daddy, scrambled right up the rigging, grabbed Hanson by the shin, and carried him upside down to the top where he'd be safe, left him there, placed carefully with an angry mutter. And so he's okay, let me tell you about something good that's happened here, which is nice. And he's trying to kind of finish this off in a good way. And then he is distracted and he asks Stephen, what in the world are you pottering about for? And Stephen's kind of in no mood to hear this. He says he's been searching every nook and cranny in the entire vile tub, meaning the surprise, for his one remaining piece of rosin that, rats have eaten all of his others. And he thinks, Jack's just sort of called me out. He says, as a matter of fact, check your pocket. Well, Jack's look of righteous indignation changes to a flush when he reaches in, pulls out the rosin, and apologizes. Well, Stephen takes it well. He's wiping off the fluff and the hair, and he asks Jack, well, have you been playing? And Jack says, well, really meant to, but I realized how much paperwork I need to complete before we get to Madeira here. So, no, I haven't. So back again, Ian, as you say, thoughts about music, rosin's appearing, but no music.
Yeah, and we're getting closer and closer to Funchal. At first, the town looks ravaged, like it's still a wasteland from the fires that we heard about a little while ago. But as they get in closer, they can see that the most important shipyard, Coelho's shipyard, has got piles of fresh timber and seems to be at work again. They salute the castle, and the return comes in much faster this time. And Stephen asks if he can be discreetly put ashore in a small boat for an hour after dark. This sounds like a Stephen Maturin maneuver of the kind that we've all come to know and understand. And it's Hanson who gets to go along with him. He's taken to seafaring so well that he's given command of the captain's gig, a very valuable assignment to have, and a very valuable gig and crew. And he's going to take Stephen in and bring him back. Stephen compliments Hanson on how naturally he's fitting in, and in this very nice little awkward half expansion of the topic, Hanson says perhaps it's because his father was a sailor. And I can almost hear this idea that Hanson probably knows that the idea of the sailor father might have been a polite fiction, and it might be to do with Uncle William, but he's avoiding being garrulous, right? Where this is the kid who learned earlier on that perhaps he should just kind of stay mum and meek. So it's a very, very nice little tiny, tiny moment of character for Hanson. Now, Stephen gets ashore and he's off to do his intelligence mission. I think he's hoping to place a message and leave a message there for Jacob. But he goes to have a drink in a place frequented by his colleagues, by these precious stone dealers, these gem dealers, guarded, by the way, by English pugilists, English prize fighters. He's fascinated by the secretive way that these dealers exchange packages and whispers without really taking any account to look at and check what's delivered to them. There's this really tight connection, this tight bond of trust between these gem dealers. And he's shocked to see that he doesn't have to leave word. There is Jacob. Now, they exchange a fleeting, meaningless glance, obviously recognizing each other and meaning that they're going to go and have an encounter away from this busy exchange area. Stephen pays his bill, leaves, and Jacob catches up with him down the road. Thankfully, Jacob had an umbrella. Of course, Stephen's come without an umbrella. Jacob with the umbrella gets to protect them both from the rain, and now we get to exchange some news, right?
Right. Well, Jacob sends Sir Joseph's greetings, and reports the latest intelligence that Sir Lindsay, this other commander that, another group of Chileans has requested, will probably sail on the 27th of the month, call here at Funchal, where his agents, who Jacob calls a precious set of boobies, are presently buying war surplus arms. He says that this Lindsay has no countenance from the Admiralty, and certainly not from the Hydrographical Office. He's just a private person invited by a private committee. The Chilean declarations have not been officially recognized or even acknowledged by the English government. So it's still hands-off covert mission. It's been reported that Lindsay has a moderate ship sloop sold out of the service, and another one, the Asp, being repaired for him in Rio. So he's going to stop by here in Madeira, sail across to Rio. He's been asked to train the Chilean authorities, and at this, Jacob kind of trails off. And the text says, if such a name can be applied to such a disparate self-elected committee or collection of committees that are likely to split at any moment. And he's kind of going off on this train of thought.
So Stephen calls Jacob back from his little rant, from his commentary on the situation here. And he says what's going to happen. He is now to train the Chilean Navy, since Spain holds the Chiloe archipelago in the south and has small Spanish men of war and privateers haunting the coast in the south. While in the north, there are some important vessels in the great Peruvian naval base at Callao. Stephen asks then, have we got any recent Chilean intelligence? And by the way, Mike, this is great stuff, because he would have been expecting to receive intelligence about Chile many, many weeks or months removed here. He's got the chance to hear directly from Jacob what he thinks is going on. Jacob, it turns out, had learned from an intelligent Chilean business connection who specializes in Muso emeralds, that's emeralds from Colombia, the best emeralds in the world, that a split is imminent between the group in the north, led by Bernardo O'Higgins and San Martin. These are the ones who had beaten the royalists at Chacabuco and invited Captain Aubrey. And the group in the south, the people who had invited this guy, Captain Lindsay. And Jacob goes on to say, the southern gentlemen are more idealist, their feet well off the ground, whereas the northerners, under O'Higgins and San Martin, with much more limited aims, are very much more efficient. And although they have some lamentable friends, I think they are, upon the whole, very much less self-seeking. And Mike, you were picking up earlier on this potential theme here of groups being different from each other. I think we're back in the same territory again. This is useful information, but it doesn't make Stephen's life very much easier. He says, it's deeply complicated. There are many possibilities for making grave mistakes, and he really wishes that Jacob could arrive in Chile before the surprise so that he'd have no apparent connection to the surprise and could therefore gather intelligence. Jacob says, well, it can be done. It can be done using Sir Joseph's man in Buenos Aires, Mr. Bridges of the Chancery. By the way, Mike, we could do a whole other branch off here into Graham Greene, because I hear man in Buenos Aires and I think about our man in Havana. And I wonder if our man in was a signal that maybe Patrick O'Brien had dropped into reading some of the spy novels of Graham Greene. Anyhow, some of them are set in Latin America. I think our man in Havana, obviously set in Cuba. The honorary consul was set in Argentina, I think. So it was a setting that Graham Greene obviously liked. Anyhow, set aside. Our man in Buenos Aires, Mr. Bridges of the Chancery. Who is he? Stephen says he's heard of him, but he'd missed a lot of what Sir Joseph had to say about him because Sir Joseph had been talking quietly for emphasis, and Stephen didn't want to say, eh? Or what? I'm like, that's another blessing of advancing years, right? Your ability to excuse yourself for hearing loss without a corresponding loss of vanity.
Right, absolutely. That's right. Well, Jacob says Bridges is an eminent mountaineer who's climbed astonishing Andean peaks with his friends, Araucanians of the most ferocious kind, and traveled a whole range of unknown passages in the Andes. And Jacob believes that with the help of Bridges and his guides, he can be in Chile long before the surprise gets around the frozen horn. Jacob says he loves climbing. He knows all the peaks of Jubal Druze. It's a mountain range in Syria. By the way, the highest point of that mountain range, the one that Jacob has just mentioned, is about just under 6,000 feet, but the highest points in the Chilean Andes are above 22,000 feet. So
Wow.
I worry a little bit that Jacob's like, I love mountain climbing, and I'm really accomplished here. Going, well, we know about mountain climbing and Stephen and the Andes. We had that back Wide Dark Sea. Was that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it's fascinating too because okay, wait a minute, Wine Dark Sea, mountain climbing in the Andes. Hanson has the same watch as Steven. Ian, remind me, didn't Steven's watch come in?
Yeah, Stephen's watch. We've had it mentioned a lot in the canon. There was the time when Stephen and Eduardo the guide were trying to cross the Andes, and they almost came to their end in that snowy blizzard on the mountain pass. And there's this moment when they kind of wake up and basically realize that they're going to survive. I'll dig into the text here. It says, back in the Wine Dark Sea, at some remote given point, Stephen's waking mind distinctly perceived the minute voice of the watch deep in his bosom, striking 5 and then the half. Can this be? He asked, and feeling deep within his bosom, he pressed the repeating knob, proving to us, by the way, that this is a Breguet repeater. 5, said the watch again, and then the shriller half. At the same moment, he realized that the wind had stopped. And it's really nice, Mike. Who knows whether it's a coincidence or whether it's just one of those things where O'Brien's mind is just letting us link back to an earlier moment when the presence of the watch was something to do with Stephen being a bit redeemed or a bit saved somehow.
Right. In my mind, if the repeater hadn't gone off, Stephen might have frozen to death in that cave because he's got to wake Eduardo up. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, Andes again, watches again. Hanson has a watch. I don't know. Maybe, like you say, maybe just these things are in the back of O'Brien's mind, or maybe we'll see what turns out of that. But after all this possibility of Jacob being able to get across Latin America if he can get dropped in Buenos Aires first, Stephen says, well, tell you what, would like you to bring your luggage discreetly to the naval depot in the morning, say you belong to the surprise, and have them roll out 7 casks of rhubarb purgative. So we're right back like we ended the last chapter here. 7 more casks of rhubarb purgative. And Stephen says, I'll meet you there when I'm coming to pick up more medical supplies. Now, Ian, we had this thing about these Indian guides or these guides, the ferocious guides that we mentioned in this last paragraph. Any idea who these folks are?
Well, Oricanians, however you pronounce it, they were a group of Indians, South American Indians, defeated by Ambrosio O'Higgins, who in the real world timeline was the father of Bernardo O'Higgins, who we've just heard mentioned. The Oricanians were a fierce and resistant native tribe living somewhere between the Biobío River and Valdivia in Chile. So spot on in terms of references here. They had a strong influence across the Andes ranges in the 1800s. They ultimately, it turns out, prevailed against the Spanish, and they're the kind of folks that clearly have got the presence of mind and the gumption to resist the colonial oppressors, and they know the routes across the Andes. So as a likely real world set of people, a real world community that could be helpful to Stephen and Jacob, I think they're absolutely dead on here. So this is all falling into place, including if they can pass off this ruse of surreptitiously getting Jacob aboard so that nobody there in Funchal notices that Jacob's going aboard the Surprise in anything other than a routine capacity. Back in the cabin, Stephen bursts in on Jack reading his Bible and begs Jack's pardon. Jack says, I was just reading a most uncomfortable piece in Galatians. Damned whatever you do, almost. And Mike, this is another great reference. I've got to turn to you here to tell us what Jack might have been reading in Galatians and what might have made him feel uncomfortable. I think I can imagine.
Yeah, it's funny. It's Galatians is a target-rich environment for making Jack uncomfortable. there's a number of things we could pull out here. Maybe he stumbled across Galatians 5:24, which reads, "Those who belong to Jesus Christ have crucified the sinful nature with its passions and desires." And just before this verse, it mentioned if you're filled with the Spirit, there's no more sexual immorality, no impurity, no hatred, no discord, no jealousy, no rage, no selfish ambition, envy, drunkenness. I can see Jack reading this going, but I'm thinking, all right, I'm not seeing Jack as a guy that thinks about receive the gift of the Spirit. I'm thinking of Jack as this rule following naval man. And maybe he stopped at Galatians 3:10-11, where Galatians is pretty clear here. All those who rely on observing the law are under a curse, for it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law." So Jack, who has the articles read every Sunday as part of the church service, like, okay, if you're not following all the rules and you think you're going to be saved because you're a rule follower, yeah, well, Paul goes on to say, clearly no one is justified before God by the law, because the righteous will live by faith. And so it's funny. I was thinking, oh my gosh, I can think of so many things in Galatians that would give Jack a hard time here. But then you pointed out, and I thought you're right. Galatians in itself is this study. The whole situation has arisen because there's two very different groups of people. These new Christians who have been Jews for generations, and these new Christians who are Gentiles. And Paul is wrestling with the fact that the Galatians are hearing from both sets of missionaries, himself kind of more targeted towards Gentiles, and some of the other apostles and their disciples targeting more towards people who are still kind of Jewish and Christian here. So I wonder, these North Chileans, these Southern Chileans, these all we've been getting all these different kinds of groups of whales, groups of patients, groups of revolutionaries. Maybe Patrick O'Brien is once again threading a theme through this chapter and perhaps this book.
Oh, it's great, isn't it? It's such good stuff. Now, one group that we know is pretty solid is the grouping of Stephen and Jack and their immediate allies. Stephen tells Jack that he's seen Jacob, that Jacob's going to join them tomorrow and travel to Rio with them, and then go overland to Chile, making use of his mountain climbing creds to be able to be their local intelligence source in South America. He tells Jack about the news of Sir David Lindsay setting out, about his ships, and says Jacob will come and give you the details more accurately tomorrow. So David, we learn, already has people assigned to buy weapons here in Madeira. Stephen doesn't want Jacob's presence or his coming aboard the Surprise to give any sign to any observer that there's collusion going on between Jacob and the Surprise's mission. Jack says, well, I don't know about the forces that you're telling me that Lindsay has, this moderate ship sloop, but he does remember that the other smaller ship, the tottering old Asp, is one that he knows. And he says, I doubt that they could survive one broadside from the Surprise. So Jack, like always, has got a bit of naval hubris at his disposal here. This is good news, he says. There's plenty of time to touch at Freetown, touch on the way, he says, and still get to Chile in time if they don't have any bad luck in the doldrums. And this is the good old boredom in the smoke. There's not a moment to lose. Jack is on the bounce here. He's ready to go. But, Mike, this is a really tricky moment for Stephen. This phrase, touch and away, seems like it's not giving Stephen the most comforting message.
No, Stephen's pretty upset. Touch it away. Saying, he reminds Jack, didn't I tell you I've got inquiries of the very first interest there? And Jack says, well, inquiries, do they have to do with our mission? This mission to Chile right now? And Stephen says, well, perhaps not quite directly, and Jack says, well, how long do you need there? And the text says, after a hesitation, Stephen said, Jack, we are very old friends, and I do not scruple to tell you in confidence that I mean to beg Christine Wood to marry me. Aubrey was perfectly taken aback, dumbfounded. He blushed. Yet quite soon his good nature and good breeding enabled him to say that he wished dear Stephen every success, a most capital plan, he was sure, and that Surprise should lie there until she grounded on her beef bones if Stephen so desired. Wow. I was like, yes, Jack, what a good man. Well, Stephen says, that won't be necessary. He thinks it'll be a plain yes or no, and if it's yes, he'd like to stay a week, and if it's no, they can leave the same day. So here they are sorting it out.
This is Stephen expressing the knowledge that between Stephen Maturin and the object of his affection, Christine, they're both introverts and they're both sciencey, nerdy people. And if it's a yes, a week is all the time. They'll probably get married and yeah, that'll be it. And if there's a no, he's not going to hang around playing the lute under her window. He's going to be on his way. But I'm super happy. At last, we've had sort of hints about this for many chapters. I'm happy that Stephen's finally come clean to Jack on what he's been biting his tongue about, because I think it's been pretty clear to us, the readers, for a while. Anyhow, the story moves on. Jacob comes aboard, briefs Captain Aubrey. All the supplies come aboard, including refreshing the ship's supply of round shot and powder. The Surprise sails away. And there's the usual crowd gathering in the galley. There's sort of housewives gossip group, you might say, the Café Klatsch, you might say, if you're a German speaker, the chorus, you might say, if you're into Greek drama. They're coming in to smoke. They notice that Jacob has come aboard again, and they joke about him bringing either another hand of glory or even maybe another unicorn horn. But they decide that's going to be for next time. And they get to telling a new member of the circle here, Shelmastonian, about the riches that accrued from the previous cruise. They speak really highly of the doctors, Jacob and Stephen, and about the luck that they bring. So, we are bound for Freetown, observed Pulsekeeping. Yes, said Joe Place, one of Killick's friends and a fairly reliable source of information. Which the doctor, our doctor, is sweet on the governor's lady, or, as you might say, his widow. She still lives there in the house. What? An ugly little bugger like him and that lovely piece? Cried Ebenezer Pierce, foretopman, starboard watch. For shame, Ebenezer, said Paul. Think of your arm he saved. Still, said Ebenezer, you can be a very clever doctor and still no great beauty. And in the inimical silence, he walked aft, affecting unconcern, and tripped over a bucket. I wish the doctor well, by God, said a carpenter's mate. He's had it cruel hard. End of chapter 4. With a physical comedy gag and empathy for Stephen.
Yeah, that's, love it, love it, love it. Gosh. Well, there we have it, as you say, Ian. Stephen's plan is now out to Jack in confidence, but apparently also to the rest of the crew. Right. He's told Jack in confidence, but everybody knows it. And I love the way he confides his real objective for stopping in Sierra Leone. And it's kind of neat. We had that earlier scene with the rosin as a little bit of counterpoint, but also different way of expressing this great relationship between the two of them, showing how strong that is and how far we've come from the octagonal room and another potential duel in Post Captain. But I've got to say, the lack of music worries me a little bit.
Yeah. And Mike, as well, I don't know whether to be worried about the further obstacles to Chile, or just to roll my eyes and go, we've been moving slowly towards Chile for so many books that I'm kind of punch drunk with it all. Anyhow, we have learned a bit more about this character, Captain David Lindsay. We've had this comment that Lindsay's smaller ship, the Asp, is vulnerable to a broadside from the Surprise. He didn't touch wood when he said that, I don't think. Are they thinking that Lindsay and this little squadron of his might actually be an enemy, a rival in battle when they get to Chile? Or maybe are the differences between the two groups fighting for independence in the north and the south of Chile, are they going to lead to a fight between the two groups of Chileans? Not unlike, Mike, as you said earlier on, the conflict arising between the different groups of Christians and Galatians, not unlike, as you say, the disparity between the different groups of Wales, the different groups of everybody here.
Yeah, and another thing in this chapter that really caught my attention, I'm really growing fond of Horatio Hanson, and I love the way he's coming along. I love his relationship with Jack, and of course, it really worries me.
Yeah,
anytime we have a new youngster, and I like some of them live throughout the canon and still love them today, but I worry some of them don't make it here. Now, I'm kind of noting too the way O'Brien and Jack are kind of tying Hanson to Mr. Daniel. Their workings. Oh, go climb with Mr. Daniel and all of a sudden. And there's quite the focus on the midshipman's berth. And even though I presume Storr is no longer one of them, this guy that we had a problem with, hopefully he's gone. My brain keeps telling me, watch this space. What's going on? And again, I said, I have no idea what's coming up. I need to read ahead to find out. But we're getting a lot of midshipman attention focus this time.
We really are. But also, Mike, we have a new romantic relationship to focus on. The next stop, perhaps touching a belaying pin, is Sierra Leone and Christine Woods. Could it really be that easy? Is he ever given an easy ride that way? Poor old Stephen Maturin. Does Patrick O'Brien ever give him a smooth path to low? Who knows? We know that the loss of Diana echoed the loss of Mary in O'Brien's life. Is he going to express hope for redemption for Stephen and let this thing with Christine Wood go off easily? Everything else that I know about O'Brien as a writer makes me doubt that, but who knows? Just like the carpenter's mate said there, Mike, the doctors had it cruel hard, so I think we're all hoping that we're going to make it to Sierra Leone and that things are going to go well for Stephen just this once.
Right. Well, I guess there's only one way to find out. Ian, what do you say next week? To a little bit more Patrick O'Brien.
Mike, I should like that of all things. And he's going to take Stephen in and bring him back. Stephen consummate. Stephen. Blah, 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 blah. Stephen compliments Hanson on how naturally he's fitting in.